Internet, and welcome to my US travel diaries number 8. So, since I say hello, Internet, I basically mean hello, the 6 of you who apparently find these amusing. I don't know why, but I've been asked to make another one, so here we go. Today we are going to walk along the Grand Canyon. We are going to argue over which name a certain park ranger has. We are going to look at abandoned Indian cliff dwellings, and we are going to move into Utah. So yeah, amuse yourself. On this day, the first and only sort of entire day we would have at the canyon, we got up, as you may remember from my last video, about 5 a.m. First of all, we wanted to take a long bus trip out to the western part of the canyon area where private cars are not allowed to go, and we wanted to go so early that there wasn't as many people as my father remembered from a earlier trip he did with my mother a couple of years earlier. We also wanted to see the sunrise and do all this while it was still at least comparatively cool. The last thing, and the thing with the people, turned out to be a very, very good idea. The sunrise was absolutely amazing over the canyon, but more importantly was the others, because when we came down to where the first bus was going, just around 6 o'clock, there was only about 5 or 6 other people waiting to get on, but when we returned 3 hours later, there was already standing about maybe 200 or 300 people waiting to board the buses. So yeah, that might be an idea if people will stay at the Grand Canyon somewhere. If you want to go out towards Hermit's Rest and see that part of the canyon, go early. Anyway, we boarded the bus and went out towards the last stop, about 6 miles out, a place called Hermit's Rest. There are, I think, about 8 stops on the way out there where you can get off, see stuff, take a bus forward, take a bus backwards. Though be aware, because some of the buses, or rather, if a bus is going outwards, it will only stop at some of the stops. If a bus is going the other way, it might not stop at all of the stops, so just be aware of what you're doing. But we went all the way out there. We met a lovely American family who, as usual, spent the 20 minutes we were driving basically just quizzing us about Denmark. That's always fun, and it always happens. Leaving aside the parochialness that some Americans do suffer from, I have never actually met any American who isn't at least interested in asking about other countries when they get the chance. Anyway, we went out to the canyon, then we saw what we had to see. We took the bus again halfway back, then we got off and walked back to the hotel right out at the canyon edge. This is really interesting because you see not just from the viewing areas, but see parts of the canyon you might not otherwise would have, and of course, again, you see the possibility of walking all the way out to the edge and everything. At this point, the temperature was rising, so again, it was really a good idea, probably, that we hadn't been there from in the middle of the day, because, well, none of us are really all that warm, how to put it, warmth adapted. We only had so and so much water with us anyway, so yeah. That was it. Eventually, however, at around 10:30, we reached back to the hotel. At this point, it had gotten somewhat warm, so while my father went up to secure us places in a cliff walk tour that a park ranger was going to do around 11, I went to our hotel room to do some business and also bring back some water that we had in the refrigerator there. Anyway, we got up there and we walked around with Ranger Maggie for about a 1.5-mile trip around the canyon edge, where she talked about how the canyon had formed, the various animals you can find there, and the original Paleo Indians that lived there at least as much as 12,000 years back. It was incredibly interesting, and if you find yourself a Grand Canyon, you should definitely take a tour like that. Now, I say Ranger Maggie, and that's because that's the name we kind of, sort of agree upon. However, it's been more than 7 years since it's happened now, and basically every time we talk about this, we have an argument about it. Because a bit later in the day, we went to another part of the canyon village area to listen to a talk about the Californian condor, because of course Grand Canyon is famous for its condors, except of course on this particular trip we didn't see a single one. However, even to this day we still argue about whether or not the girl that talked about the condors were Ranger Maggie, or if it was the one that let us on the cliff walk. So yeah, that's the thing. However, anyway, we got that over with, and, well, after that, we mostly relaxed for the rest of the day and got ready to prepare to leave the next day. This was when we realized that this was our first trip to the Grand Canyon together, and yes, someone had died. Someone had fallen down the cliffside on the northern edge, and a lot of people were basically walking around over there trying to find parts of the body. This set a tone for our trips because we have never actually been to the Grand Canyon without people dying. Now, I know a lot of people die at the Grand Canyon each year, but I think maybe we should stop going there just for the sake of it. But that was that day. It was incredibly interesting. You should definitely go on one of these, either the bus route or the cliff walk or whatever you have time for when you're at the Grand Canyon, because it is really, really fascinating. Well, as you can see on the pictures, I have spoken way too long about the Grand Canyon because, yeah, we also, the next day had to move up to Colorado in order to check out Mesa Verde's famous Indian ancient Pueblo cliff dwellings. So that was the next day. Most of the day was during transport from the Grand Canyon up to the Colorado town of Cortez. Most of the way went through various Native American Indian reservations, the Navajo Reservation and the Hopi Reservation. Today, the Hopi Reservation is completely enclosed in the Navajo Reservation, and because of various issues with daylight saving time, it basically means that you can have some very interesting situations driving through that, because you're coming in from a place that has daylight savings time to a place that doesn't have it, to a place that has it, to a place that doesn't have it, or the other way around. I can't remember. Anyway, it's always getting a bit confusing when you're driving in that particular area. But anyway, we drove through the Navajo Reservation, and one thing that is interesting in the Navajo Reservation is, of course, the amount of buttes that are there, because the Navajo Reservation contains Monument Valley, where, of course, a lot of the Great Westerns were shot back in the day. That was actually where we decided to get a meal at a Navajo-run hotel right in the middle of Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon? Bullshit, we've been to the Grand Canyon. Right in the middle of Monument Valley, we decided to get some lunch at a Navajo-run hotel, which is actually an interesting place. First of all, it's actually fairly cheap, and you can live right there in the middle of Monument Valley, waking up to some rather spectacular vistas, and also take guided trips out from there. We, however, just decided to get a burger and move on, but it was still a very interesting sort of experience and a very nice sight to just stand there and looking out over where, well, a lot of my Western heroes as a child had ridden by. So that's the thing. But anyway, after that, we moved further out the Navajo Reservation and eventually left that and actually drove into Utah. At Mexican Hat, a small, uninteresting place with a interesting rock that is called, funnily enough, Mexican Hat. After that, before moving into Colorado, we decided to take a stop at Four Corners Monument because, well, my mom and my dad had already stood with a foot in a lot of different states, and I thought it could be interesting. This was also, by the way, our first visit to New Mexico, because the entrance to New Mexico is in the entrance to Four Corners is in New Mexico, and you drive in the state for about 1 minute. However, when we got there, it turned out that the Four Corners Monument was closed due to construction. I'm still not sure if they were constructing a new state boundary or whatever they were doing, but for some reason we haven't actually been back since, so I still haven't stood with feet in various different states. That is, of course, a fault on my part. However, eventually we then decided we didn't have much choice, so we left again, and about 3 minutes later, we had again left New Mexico. So all in all, we had been in New Mexico for about 4 minutes, but hey, I call that a visit. Eventually, however, we moved further up into Colorado until we reached US Route 491. US Route 491 is completely uninteresting, except for the fact that it used to be US Route 666, the Devil Highway, which has its own set of stories I might get back to on another trip, but this wasn't too relevant on this one. From afar, we saw Ship Rock, an interesting rock formation that is considered holy to many Indian tribes in the area, and if you're around, you should definitely try to see it. We thought about going closer to it, but I actually prefer to see it from afar when you can't see the base of it and it really just looks like some sharp knife cutting in to the air. It's really interesting. But eventually, we managed to get to Cortez, where we got a hotel room and some early dinner, and we were ready for the next day, where we were going up to Mesa Verde to see the Indian cliff dwellings. The visit to Mesa Verde, there isn't that much to say about, to be perfectly honest. Because of some road work, it took forever to get up to the top of the mountain where the cliff dwellings were. But once we got up there, it was very interesting, of course. We went to see primarily something called a Spruce Tree House, which is primarily called like that because there is a huge tree standing around that is neither a spruce or any other kind of tree of that description, but a name is a name. But yeah, go watch this place. We thought about paying to get down to Cliff Palace, the biggest of the old sort of villages or homes or whatever you call these things, house agglomerations, but that would be climbing around ladders, and it was getting warm, and we could see that just as well from afar, we felt, since it's basically the same as Spruce Tree House, where you only have to walk up and down a 300 feet hill. And again, Cliff Palace is the same, just bigger. We were down in some of the circular rooms that probably served the ancient Pueblans as ceremonial areas and so on. And again, it was all very interesting. One of the things that were fascinating, however, was that based upon the size of the houses, it looks like that the average height for men and women in those days were somewhere between 150 and 160 centimeters, so about just over 5 feet, which is interesting because that's almost the same as it was in Europe at the same time. So yeah, that just doesn't really mean anything, just finds that particularly fascinating. Also, those small rooms are called kivas, because now I remember. Thank you, Timmy. Good for you. But anyway, again, we refused to pay extra to get down to Cliff Palace. Instead, we just drove around the top of Mesa Verde, seeing the view out over the plains below, and just watching whatever Indian ruins we could find, and it was all very interesting. After that, we drove home and basically moved up towards Utah. Oh, I forgot to say, the day before, we ate probably the most expensive meal we had eaten in America at that time, and it probably actually took 4 years to match it. It was at a restaurant called Nero, and it was, like I said, in Cortez, which is basically a small town in Colorado. There is tourists, but not that many of them. It's not that huge itself, but this Nero's was basically like a fine dining Italian restaurant. So we paid the most money for the smallest portions I have ever had. We have since followed Nero on line, and it seems like that particular way of doing business in small town America was not a brilliant idea, because the restaurant now, while it still exists, have new owners, which has lowered prices and raised portion sized. Again, this is America, people. If you want to do that, go to New York. Don't go to rural Colorado. I'm just saying. However, after having visited Mesa Verde, we continued up the highway towards Utah, because we were going to Moab, where we were going to see the area and take a slip rock Jeep tour, which actually turned out to be a slip rock Humvee tour, as well as live in a very interesting hotel along the banks of the Colorado River, about 14 miles from town. It was on the way up there, however, that I suddenly got a bad premonition regarding something I had seen in the papers that morning, and went out. We stopped the car, I dug out the papers, and we realized, god damn it, we actually ordered that hotel not from that day and the 2 days we had expected, but from the next day and one more. This was a bad thing, since that last day we had ordered the hotel, we were already supposed to have left Moab and gone on to Salt Lake City. So, well, we had to figure out something about that, but since we couldn't check in on that particular day, we instead arrived at Utah and found a Super 8 motel. My first day at a Super 8. I have done it since. It's not the best hotel chain, but as a general rule, it's a pretty good one where you don't get too surprised by terrible rooms, and actually has a fairly decent room rate, as well as some decent internet. In the last couple of years, I think actually Super 8 has improved quite a bit from the earlier days, but it will still never be my favorite hotel chain. It is kinda cheap. But anyway, we were in Moab. Now, there's a lot of national parks surrounding Moab, and we intended to see as many of them as we possibly could in the 2 days we had there. And since it was still only about 3 p.m. at the time we had checked into the hotel, we decided to go on to the first, namely Arches National Park, which is, of course, a park filled with various rock arches created by erosion and wind. Basically erosion, mostly wind and water erosion. And we went up there. We went in, as usually we paid with our national park year card. Again, at the end, we had spent a lot more money, or rather, we would have spent a lot more money than we ended up doing without paying $80 for that particular year pass. It was a really, really good deal. So, but we went into the Arches, and this is part of what me and my dad calls our nature top 10 in America. You know, the top 10 just pure nature things we like and want to see, and Arches is definitely part of that. There is, of course, the famous Delicate Arch, the largest sort of icon arch in the park, standing alone on a cliffside, where people can hike up, and definitely do hike up, even if it takes 3 hours each way and you need a lot of water to get there. Delicate Arch is the arch you see on Utah car number plates. But there are several others. There are things to see. There are the Devil Gardens, where you can go in and see stuff like the Landscape Arch, which is the longest or biggest arch in the park, almost 300 yards. That is bullshit, 300 feet from side to side. And we saw other things. Again, we saw Delicate Arch. We saw one of my favorites, which was the Windows and Landscape Arch, and the arch called the Elephants, and so on. It was all very, very, very interesting. Double arch. There's a lot of things to see there, and again, I cannot but say, if you're ever in the area, go visit Arches National Park. I've been there several times now, and it never stops being good. Of course, you have to like seeing rocks and sort of semi-arid desert landscapes, but overall, I cannot emphasize enough how you need to go there. Anyway, by this point it had become somewhat late, so we decided to leave the park and drive out to the southern end of town where we had seen the very interesting sort of small, looked like family-owned restaurant called the Branding Iron. We ate there, it was a family restaurant, it was a very local restaurant, by which I mean this was primarily local people eating there and we were absolutely the only tourists. However, the food was really, really good and there was enough of it and it wasn't very expensive. So overall, that was very good. I cannot remember if it still exists, but if it does, it's a good place to eat if you find yourself in Moab. After that, it was back to the hotel so we could rest up for the next day with a lot more national parks and the Hummer trip out in the Slip Rock areas that was actually going to be the highlight of the entire 2010 trip, which is very, very, very fascinating considering how much awesome stuff we had seen and was going to see on the rest of that particular road trip. Well, that was it. I hope you enjoyed that. This was probably not the stretch of the trip where we have the most amusing stories to tell from or the most epic tales, but it was probably the stretch of the trip where we saw the most awesome natural experience, nature experience, and so on that in a very few days. Not that we wouldn't have major experiences later. It was quite awesome, in fact, but that was probably where we sort of, in 2 or 3 days, we saw a lot of very good stuff that are still on my to-do list today if I wanted to go back and see stuff again. But anyway, that was US Road Trip Diaries 8. I will return probably, in fact, maybe next week with a stream, possibly, talking about US travel with a few of my friends, in case any of the 4 people watching this will be interested. But overall, yeah. Until next time, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.